In November 333 BCE, on a narrow coastal strip near the Pinarus River in southern Anatolia, the fate of the ancient world hinged on a single, seemingly suicidal cavalry charge. This was the Battle of Issus, where a 23-year-old Alexander the Great turned his outnumbered expeditionary force of 40,000 Macedonians to face the colossal might of the Persian Empire under King Darius III. Darius had just executed a brilliant strategic maneuver. By slipping behind the Macedonian lines, the Persian king had severed Alexander's supply routes and trapped the invaders between the steep Ammanus mountains and the crashing waves of the Mediterranean Sea. Darius commanded an army of over 100,000 men, possessing the sheer mass necessary to crush the Macedonian campaign permanently. Yet, in choosing this specific ground, Darius made one fatal miscalculation regarding the terrain. This narrow geographic choke point neutralized his numerical advantage and offered Alexander a fleeting window to launch a highly targeted strike directly at the Persian royal chariot. It was a calculated risk that would fracture the psychological spine of the greatest empire on Earth. Welcome back to World Chronicles. Today, we break down the geographic choke point, the grueling infantry clash, and the audacious cavalry charge that forced the great king of Persia to abandon his army and run for his life. The collision at Issus was the inevitable result of a massive strategic paradox. Alexander was fighting a land war to dismantle a naval empire. A year earlier, in 334 BCE, the young Macedonian king had shattered the local Persian defense at the Battle of the Granicus River. Rather than striking directly east into the heartland of the Achaemenid Empire, Alexander made a highly disciplined, counterintuitive command decision. He turned his army south, marching methodically down the coast of Asia Minor. His objective was not immediate territorial conquest, but naval suppression. The Persian fleet dominated the Mediterranean, posing a constant threat of an amphibious strike against a largely undefended Greece. Lacking the ships to challenge them on the water, Alexander systematically besieged and captured every Persian naval base along the coast, effectively grounding their fleet by denying them safe harbors and logistical support. This methodical coastal campaign presented an existential crisis for the imperial government in Babylon. King Darius III realized that his regional governors, the satraps, had failed catastrophically to contain the Macedonian bridgehead. The frontier defenses had collapsed, and an invading army of 40,000 hardened infantry and cavalry was systematically dismantling the western edge of his empire. The supreme commander could no longer delegate the defense of his realm. Darius summoned a massive imperial levy, drawing troops from across his vast territories to assemble an army of unparalleled size. While ancient sources exaggerate the numbers, modern military historians estimate Darius marched out of Babylon with well over 100,000 regular troops, heavy cavalry, and elite Greek mercenaries. The contrast between the two approaching forces was stark, reflected entirely in their strategic mobility and logistics. Alexander led a lean expeditionary force, accustomed to moving fast and living off the land, stripping their baggage train to the bare minimum to maintain operational speed. In stark contrast, the Persian mobilization required a logistical footprint so massive it defied ancient comprehension. When the imperial army marched out of Babylon and across the Syrian plains, its presence was announced by choking dust clouds stretching to the horizon. Accompanying the regular troops was the vast royal household, moving at the sluggish pace of an opulent traveling city, complete with the royal treasury, court officials, and an endless stream of heavy supply wagons. Despite its immense size, Darius drove this military machine northward with surprising strategic agility. He aimed to intercept the invaders before they could penetrate deeper into the Levant. Alexander, believing the Persian army was still gathering far to the east, rushed his forces through the coastal mountain passes, eager to secure the strategic choke points of northern Syria. He left his sick and wounded soldiers behind in a base camp near the coastal town of Issus, pressing forward to force a decisive battlefield confrontation. The operational intelligence of both commanders was operating on a dangerous delay, and the two armies were now maneuvering blind around the jagged peaks of the Ammanus mountain range. Alexander pushed aggressively southward, confident he was hunting the Persian forces, but he was about to discover that the hunter had just become the prey. Alexander's immediate response to finding Darius in his rear was not panic, but cold, methodical redeployment. He halted his southward advance into Syria, ordered his 40,000 men to about-face, and force marched them back north through the night. As dawn broke, the Macedonian vanguard emerged onto the coastal plain of the Pinarus River. Here, the strategic trap Darius had constructed was countered by the stark reality of local geography. The battlefield was framed by the Mediterranean Sea to the west and the steep, jagged foothills of the Ammanus Mountains to the east. The distance between the crashing surf and the impassable mountain slopes measured barely 2.5 kilometers. This narrow corridor acted as a geographic straitjacket on the Persian war machine. An imperial army of over 100,000 men requires vast open plains to maximize its primary advantage: the ability to extend its battle lines, overlap the enemy's flanks, and execute sweeping envelopments. On the cramped plain of the Pinarus, Darius was completely robbed of his lateral mobility. The great king simply did not have the physical space to deploy his colossal numerical superiority. Constrained by the mountains and the sea, the Persian command staff was forced to deploy their forces in extreme depth. While the vanguard was packed tightly along the river, tens of thousands of light infantry and provincial levies from the eastern reaches of the empire were stacked rank upon rank behind the main line. From a tactical standpoint, a soldier trapped in the 30th rank cannot swing a sword, fire an arrow, or project force against the enemy. This deep stacking effectively neutralized the Persian numbers, turning the vast majority of Darius's army into a static mass of spectators, unable to participate in the initial clash. However, Darius intended to leverage the Pinarus River itself as an impenetrable barrier. He anchored his defensive line directly behind the watercourse, exploiting the natural topography. In this sector, the riverbanks were steep and heavily eroded, forming a natural jagged trench line that disrupted any organized formation attempting to cross. In the few areas where the banks sloped gently enough to permit a rapid crossing, Persian engineers aggressively hardened the position, driving sharp wooden palisades deep into the mud. Darius was dictating the terms of the engagement. To reach him, Alexander would have to wade through the current and attack uphill into a fortified position. Recognizing the geographical lock, Alexander meticulously managed his approach. He deployed his heavy infantry, the famed Macedonian phalanx, in the center, in expanding their line slowly as the coastal plain widened near the river. He anchored his left wing under the command of his veteran general, Parmenion, directly against the Mediterranean shoreline. He anchored his right wing securely against the rocky slopes of the Ammanus. By stretching his 40,000 troops entirely across the 2.5-kilometer gap, Alexander guaranteed that his flanks were secure. No Persian unit could slip around his edges. The battle was thus forced into a brutal, head-on collision. Darius responded to the Macedonian deployment by shifting his most lethal asset. Recognizing that the only ground flat enough for heavy cavalry was on the Persian right, resting against the beach, he massed his elite armored horsemen there, preparing to shatter Parmenion's wing. Meanwhile, in the center, Darius placed his most reliable and heavily armed shock troops, 30,000 Greek hoplite mercenaries, standing directly across from the advancing Macedonian phalanx. As the two armies closed the final distance, the rhythmic, deafening crash of tens of thousands of bronze-greaved boots echoed off the mountain walls, creating an overwhelming acoustic pressure cooker. Alexander had successfully weaponized the terrain to neutralize the Persian numbers, locking the Achaemenid Empire into a frontal assault. The geography leveled the playing field, but crossing the river meant the Macedonian center would have to survive a brutal meat grinder against Persia's most elite infantry. The Macedonian advance began with the center pushing forward into the swift, shallow waters of the Pinarus. For the Macedonian phalanx, our absolute cohesion was the sole source of its invulnerability. Armed with the sarissa, a massive pike extending up to 18 feet, the phalangites relied on a perfectly level, unbroken line of spear points to project lethality. However, as the thousands of men waded into the uneven, rocky riverbed and attempted to scramble up the eroded opposite bank, the pristine geometry of their formation inevitably fractured. The natural obstacle of the river did exactly what Persian engineers had calculated. It tore dangerous gaps into the Macedonian wall of wood and bronze. Waiting at the crest of the riverbank were Darius's 30,000 Greek mercenary hoplites. These were veteran heavy infantry, armed with shorter spears and large heavy shields, fighting under the Persian standard. On seeing the cohesion of the Macedonian phalanx break apart in the river, the mercenaries immediately exploited the vulnerability. They surged forward down the banks, driving their weight into the fractured Macedonian lines. The collision in the muddy shallows was a grinding press of bodies and shields, punctuated by the sharp, concussive splintering of ashwood pikes as the two heavily armored infantry blocks ground into one another. It was a brutal, fratricidal struggle. Greeks in Persian pay were fighting to hold the line against Greeks fighting for Macedonian supremacy. The center of the battlefield rapidly devolved into a static, horrific stalemate. The Macedonians found themselves trapped in the water, forced to push uphill against an enemy that held the high ground and the fortified palisades. In this confined space, a tactical finesse evaporated. Officers could no longer issue complex commands over the din. It became a contest of sheer physical endurance and localized unit discipline. The Macedonian battalions nearest the center took catastrophic casualties as they were pinned against the steep banks, unable to advance through the dense wall of mercenary shields, yet forbidden by their training and their king to take a single step backward. While the infantry bled in the riverbed, an even more immediate crisis was unfolding on the far left wing, resting against the Mediterranean shoreline. Here, Alexander had placed his most experienced general, Parmenion, with a clear, grim directive: hold the line at all costs. Facing him across the flat coastal sand was the main striking arm of the Persian army, a massive concentration of heavily armored cavalry, and supported by allied light horsemen. Knowing this was the only sector of the battlefield flat enough for a concentrated cavalry charge, Persian commanders committed their heaviest units to crush the Macedonian flank. The Persian heavy horsemen surged across the river delta, crashing into Parmenion's mixed force of Peloponnesian and Thessalian cavalry. The sheer weight and numerical superiority of the Persian charge immediately pushed the Macedonians backward. Parmenion's troopers were fighting a strictly defensive action, yielding ground inch by inch along the beach to absorb the kinetic shock of the assault without breaking formation. The tactical geometry of the entire battlefield rested entirely on Parmenion's shoulders. If his wing shattered, the Persian cavalry would sweep unhindered behind the Macedonian line, in enveloping the already trapped phalanx in the river from the rear and annihilating Alexander's army in a matter of hours. Despite their elite discipline, the Macedonian left wing was slowly being ground down into the sand. The Persian cavalry commanders, sensing the vulnerability, poured continuous reinforcements into the coastal sector, relentlessly increasing the pressure. Parmenion desperately traded space for time, extending his lines as thinly as possible to prevent the enemy from turning his flank. But the breaking point was rapidly approaching. The battle had reached its most critical juncture, heavily favoring the defensive preparations and numerical weight of the Achaemenid forces. Parmenion's left flank was buckling, and the center was bleeding out. If Alexander did not break the Persian lines within minutes, and the entire Macedonian army would be crushed against the sea. While Parmenion's left wing bordered on collapse, and the phalanx bled in the center, the tactical reality on the Macedonian right wing was entirely different. Here, positioned against the rocky, uneven foothills of the Ammanus Mountains, Alexander personally commanded the elite companion cavalry, supported by light infantry and Agrionian javelin men. The Persian commanders had attempted to mirror this deployment, anchoring their own left flank on the high ground. However, their light provincial troops lacked the heavy armor and discipline to hold the craggy, broken terrain against an aggressive Macedonian infantry push. Alexander's light troops methodically cleared the ridges, peeling the Persian left wing backward and exposing a fatal and widening gap between the Persian mountain flank and their mercenary center. From this elevated forward position, Alexander possessed a comprehensive view of the deteriorating battlefield. He saw Parmenion yielding ground to the heavy cavalry, and the center bogged down in a desperate infantry stalemate. The young king understood that a conventional battle of attrition would inevitably favor the massive numerical superiority of the Achaemenid forces. But Alexander also recognized the singular, structural vulnerability of Persian military doctrine. The entire imperial war machine was hyper-centralized. It did not operate on a flexible chain of independent command, but rather on the physical presence and survival of the great king. Darius III was positioned prominently behind the center lines in a towering royal chariot and surrounded by his elite infantry guard. To win the battle, Alexander did not need to kill 100,000 men. He only needed to kill one. Seizing the brief window of opportunity created by the collapsing Persian left, Alexander initiated what would become his signature tactical maneuver, a precision decapitation strike. He did not order a chaotic general advance. Instead, he consolidated the companion cavalry into a dense, highly disciplined wedge formation. This geometric structure was designed specifically for penetration, placing the commanding officer at the absolute tip of the spear to dictate the angle of attack and maximize kinetic transfer upon impact. Alexander angled this heavy cavalry missile not to roll up the enemy flank, but to slice diagonally behind the Persian frontline engagement, aiming directly for the royal standard. On the charge of the companion cavalry was a terrifying application of mass and velocity. As the wedge accelerated across the narrowing strip of flat ground, the thundering vibration of thousands of armored horses converging on a single point shattered the cohesion of the remaining Persian left. Alexander drove his horsemen through the widening gap, bypassing the main infantry engagement in the riverbed entirely. Once behind the primary defensive line, he violently wheeled his formation inward. The Macedonian wedge transformed into a guided projectile ripping through the vulnerable rear echelon of the Persian army, carving a bloody direct corridor toward the King of Kings. The only remaining obstacle between Alexander and absolute victory was the Persian royal guard, the elite infantry who fought desperately to shield their sovereign. The cavalry wedge slammed into this final defensive ring, initiating a vicious close-quarter struggle around the wooden wheels of the royal chariot. The protective screen of Persian nobility began to disintegrate under the immense pressure of the Macedonian assault. The companion cavalry tore through the Persian guard, and suddenly, the 23-year-old Macedonian and the king of the Persian Empire were separated by only a few yards of dying men. For a few agonizing moments, the two most powerful men in the ancient world were locked in visual range amidst the carnage. Alexander, leading from the front of the cavalry wedge, drove relentlessly toward the royal chariot. Darius III, elevated above the melee, watched his personal guard, nobles of the highest Persian bloodlines, and being systematically dismantled by the kinetic force of the Macedonian lances. The great king realized that the structural integrity of his immediate defense had failed. Facing the very real probability of death or capture within minutes, Darius's nerve broke. He made a command decision that prioritized his personal survival over the tactical integrity of his army. Abandoning his massive, ornate war chariot, which was now mired in the crush of bodies and mud, the King of Kings mounted a swift courser and fled the battlefield, turning his back on the engagement. The true catastrophe of Issus was rooted not in the Macedonian spear, but in the rigid, hyper-centralized doctrine of the Achaemenid military. The Persian army was not a unified national force bound by a shared ideology. It was a vast, multi-ethnic coalition held together solely by the physical, semi-divine presence of the great king. Darius was the absolute anchor of the entire military apparatus. When he fled, the towering royal standard, the visual focal point for over 100,000 men, abruptly vanished from the skyline. This was the equivalent of severing the central nervous system of the Imperial army. The psychological collapse was instantaneous and absolute, rippling outward from the empty royal chariot. In the center, the 30,000 Greek mercenary hoplites had been effectively stalling the Macedonian phalanx. They had held the high ground and inflicted heavy casualties in the riverbed. But as word spread that the great king had abandoned the field, their tactical advantage became entirely meaningless. Mercenaries fight for pay and a paymaster. With the paymaster gone, and the strategic rationale for holding the line evaporated. Their disciplined formation immediately dissolved as individual units abandoned the palisades and joined the desperate surge to the rear. The most tragic irony of the collapse occurred on the Mediterranean shore. The Persian heavy cavalry had successfully pushed Parmenion's wing to the breaking point. They were perhaps minutes away from shattering the Macedonian left and enveloping Alexander's entire army. Yet, as the wave of panic crashed down from the foothills to the beach, these elite horsemen realized their supreme commander had deserted them. The momentum of their victorious charge evaporated into sheer terror. They abruptly broke off their assault on the exhausted Macedonians, wheeled their horses around, and joined the chaotic stampede northward, when transforming a potential envelopment into a fatal retreat. The Persian army did not break because they were outfought. They broke because their anchor had vanished, leading to a slaughter far worse than the battle itself. The geography that had so effectively neutralized the Achaemenid numerical advantage during the battle now became the primary instrument of their annihilation. As the command structure disintegrated, tens of thousands of Persian troops simultaneously attempted to funnel back through the narrow mountain passes and coastal roads from which they had arrived. In ancient military engagements, the vast majority of casualties are rarely inflicted during the organized clash of formations. They occur during the chaotic collapse of a rout, when a retreating force loses unit cohesion and the ability to defend itself. Here, the frantic withdrawal transformed the tight bottlenecks of the Ammanus Mountains into a lethal trap. Alexander unleashed his light cavalry to run down the fragmented units, but the environment itself did much of the killing. Panicked soldiers threw down their heavy shields and weapons to flee faster, creating treacherous obstacles in the rapidly darkening defiles. The sheer terrifying compression of over 100,000 men surging into narrow ravines resulted in thousands being trampled to death by their own heavy cavalry and comrades. Ptolemy, one of Alexander's closest commanders, later recorded the grim reality of the pursuit, noting that the pursuing Macedonians crossed a deep gully using the tightly packed corpses of the enemy as a literal bridge. It was an asymmetrical slaughter, in the inevitable mathematical result of mass panic in a constrained topographical space. Despite the scale of the destruction, Alexander eventually halted the pursuit as night fell over the plain of Issus. Darius III had secured a significant head start on his swift horse, and the Macedonian king needed to reconsolidate his exhausted army. Returning to the battlefield, Alexander directed his forces toward the primary Persian encampment. The retreating army had abandoned an unimaginable logistical apparatus, leaving behind a sprawling static city of tents, baggage trains, and the imperial treasury's forward reserves. Yet, the most valuable asset remaining on the field was not the abandoned gold or the silver, but the living occupants of the royal pavilion. When Macedonian troops secured the central compound, they captured the very core of the Achaemenid dynasty: Sisygambis, the mother of Darius, Statira, his wife, and his young children. By the brutal conventions of ancient warfare, these captives were prime targets for enslavement, ransom, or execution. However, Alexander possessed an acute understanding of political psychology. He immediately dispatched a senior officer to the pavilion to assure the royal women that Darius was still alive and that they would suffer no harm under Macedonian guard. Alexander's subsequent treatment of the Persian royal family was a masterstroke of geopolitical strategy. He ordered that their regal titles be maintained, granted them the honors, servants, and comforts appropriate for a ruling family, and ensured their absolute physical protection. This was not an act of mere chivalry. It was a deliberate and calculated maneuver to strip the reigning Persian monarch of his legitimacy. By protecting the royal household that Darius had abandoned to save himself, Alexander actively positioned himself as a more capable and honorable sovereign. He was no longer acting merely as a Macedonian conqueror. He was beginning to project the magnanimity and absolute authority expected of the King of Kings. The physical threat of the imperial army had been shattered, and the diplomatic high ground had been seized. Alexander had won the battle and secured the royal hostages, but to truly conquer the empire, he would have to translate this bloody tactical victory into permanent geopolitical control. The psychological shockwave of Darius's flight shattered the centuries-old myth of Achaemenid invincibility, permanently altering the geopolitical axis of the ancient Mediterranean. With the primary imperial field army utterly destroyed in the mountain passes and the royal family held hostage in the Macedonian camp, the entire western hemisphere of the Persian Empire structurally collapsed. The rich, strategic territories of Asia Minor and the Levant were permanently stripped from the administrative control of Babylon. Furthermore, this decisive victory ripped open the terrestrial corridor southward. Alexander now possessed an undisputed marching route directly into Egypt. This consequence was paramount, as it allowed the Macedonians to complete the total strangulation of the Persian navy by capturing its final coastal bases from the landward side. The initiative of global conquest had definitively passed from the east to the west. It's beyond the immediate territorial and economic shifts. The engagement on the Pinarus River served as a lethal, undeniable proof of concept for the Macedonian military apparatus. Alexander demonstrated to the ancient world that absolute numerical superiority could be completely negated by the disciplined exploitation of terrain and the rigorous application of a combined arms doctrine. The battle perfectly validated the mechanism of the hammer and anvil on a grand imperial scale. The heavy infantry of the phalanx functioned flawlessly as the static anvil, absorbing the immense kinetic energy of the Persian center, while the companion cavalry acted as the highly mobile, decisive hammer, striking rapidly at the precise point of command weakness. Now, by intentionally channeling an army of over 100,000 men into a narrow 2.5-kilometer coastal corridor, the young king proved that geography, when weaponized by a brilliant commander, is the ultimate force multiplier. Darius III would survive his panicked ride eastward, eventually reaching the relative safety of the Mesopotamian heartland, where he would immediately begin raising an even larger army. However, the political and psychological authority required to hold a sprawling, multi-ethnic empire together had been irreparably shattered. The physical sight of the great king's heavily gilded chariot sitting abandoned in the blood-soaked mud of the riverbank signaled a fatal structural wound to the Achaemenid dynasty from which it would never truly recover. A king who abandons his troops in the field forfeits the absolute loyalty of his surviving satraps and subjects. Alexander the Great had not yet conquered the entirety of the Persian Empire in 333 BCE, but he had systematically proven that the colossal imperial structure could bleed, break, and run. The ancient world order had been upended in a single afternoon, and the long, violent road to absolute dominion now lay entirely open before the young Macedonian sovereign. Subscribe to our channel to relive the great chapters of history together.